The macabre history of the Blake sisters. Every suitor they took vanished without a trace. The year was 1834, and Willard's Hollow was the kind of town where the air itself felt tired, as if it had been breathing the same rumors for generations. Families lived by the seasons and the sermons, their lives ruled by routine. On the edge of this quiet town, past the willow trees that bent over a narrow stream, stood the Blake house. To outsiders it was nothing remarkable. White clapboard walls, pale curtains, and a garden that seemed always tended. To neighbors it was the home of three virtuous sisters, young women of faith and refinement who carried themselves with a serenity that made others feel unworthy. But the truth of the house was not in what stood above the ground. It was in the silence beneath it. Catherine Blake, the eldest, kept the home's order like an iron spine under silk. At Sunday service, she sang hymns without trembling, her eyes never leaving the altar, her posture immaculate. Margaret, the second sister, was the one people called gentle. She assisted at births and offered herbs for coughs, her touch reassuring. And Eliza, the youngest, never spoke more than a few words. Shy, they said. Bookish, they said. She carried notebooks filled with sketches of birds, bones, and the veins of leaves, as though the world's hidden design could be mapped if she looked closely enough. Together they seemed unassailable in their purity. Neighbors visited often in those days. The Blake home became a center of small gatherings. Sunday suppers with warm bread, nights of hymn singing where lantern light glowed against their neat faces. Mothers encouraged their sons to call upon the sisters, for who could doubt their virtue? They embodied everything a God-fearing household was supposed to be: disciplined, charitable, humble. If whispers of strangeness ever surfaced, why Catherine's hands were always scrubbed raw, why Margaret's herbal mixtures sometimes left the sick worse instead of better, they were quickly dismissed. Suspicion had no soil to grow in a place where appearances mattered more than questions. Willard's Hollow, though small, had its share of tragedy. Men went missing from time to time. Farm accidents, river drownings, or wanderers who simply did not return from the woods. Life was fragile, and people accepted loss as part of the natural order. So when the first suitor vanished after visiting the Blakes, no one thought much of it. A man could be taken by the wilderness or by his own restless desires. The town would pray, then carry on. Yet the house by Willow Creek remained constant, its curtains drawn neatly, its garden blooming even in seasons when others' crops withered. Inside the home, the atmosphere was carefully constructed. The sisters' lives were bound by routines so precise they became ritual. Candles were lit at exact hours, meals served with measured silence, and nightly prayers spoken in unison until their voices blended like threads of one mind. To visitors, this discipline felt holy. But within those walls it was more than devotion. It was the scaffolding of something hidden, a pattern of control that fed not faith but obsession. Catherine kept ledgers not of finances but of breath and pulse. Margaret preserved herbs not only for healing but for halting pain just short of death. And Eliza, in her notebooks, recorded the delicate structures of things not meant to be studied by a young woman's hand. The house smelled of lavender and ash. Floors gleamed as though scrubbed with endless care, though few asked why so much wood seemed newly replaced. The cellar was locked, the key always on Catherine's chain. Neighbors assumed it stored root vegetables for winter, but those who caught faint sounds from its depths spoke of them only once, then never again. In the dim glow of lanterns, visitors saw nothing more than the perfect daughters of a family lost too soon. Their parents died of illness years before, leaving the sisters to keep house alone. Their orphanhood softened hearts, creating sympathy that turned quickly into trust. Trust was the soil in which their secret thrived. For in every smile, every hymn, every bowl of soup shared with the poor, there was calculation. The sisters knew the faces they showed the world, and they wore them with the skill of actresses who understood their stage. In Willard's Hollow, reputation was armor, and they wore theirs until it gleamed. But even armor can hide rot beneath. As winter approached that year, the Blake house glowed warmly against the snow. Lanterns flickered behind its windows, shadows moving in patterns too precise to be casual. Neighbors walking home from church would hear faint singing, 3 voices blending in harmony. The sound carried through the night air, soft and holy, until one listened long enough to notice the notes bending strangely, straining at the edges of melody. But few lingered, for it was easier to believe in the illusion of goodness than to admit fear of what lived behind those pale curtains. The first missing man had not yet been tied to the sisters. The town did not yet know that every hymn they sang was a shroud, every smile a mask. But already the pattern had begun. Evil does not erupt into the world with noise and fury. It seeps like water into soil, invisible until roots are rotten. In Willard's Hollow, the Blake sisters' reputation was the perfect silence, and silence was their shield. The stream by the house flowed quietly that winter, its surface thin with ice. No one noticed how often the sisters carried buckets to its edge, emptying dark water into its current. No one questioned the faint smoke curling from the chimney long after midnight, carrying with it a smell that was almost but not quite, the smell of cooking meat. For in towns like Willard's Hollow, people survived by not asking what they did not wish to know. And so the Blake sisters remained untouched, unchallenged, and unseen in the truth of who they were. The quiet house on Willow Creek stood as it always had. White walls, pale curtains, a garden waiting for spring. But beneath its floorboards, in a darkness that knew no prayer, something had already taken root, and once it began, it would not stop. Catherine rose before light and moved through the house with quiet purpose. She counted candles, matched spoons to bowls, checked the cellar latch, and drew a ledger from beneath a folded cloth. In neat lines, she recorded the simple parts of life: the hour the fire was set, the number of visitors, the length of each hymn. In a smaller script, she noted other things: how steady a hand poured tea and how long a guest's eyes lingered on the basement door. She believed a house stayed safe when patterns stayed true, and so she measured everything until it felt like prayer. When she closed the book, the room settled. Men came to call, and she asked how they slept and how their mothers fared. She saw who washed before dinner, who laughed too loudly, who obeyed. Order was her shield, and nothing in her voice betrayed the sums kept. Margaret's mornings were softer. She crushed herbs until the air smelled of mint and bitter willow. As a midwife's assistant, she knew how to guide pain, steady breath, and pull a drowning gasp back from the edge. In a locked drawer sat drops that cooled fever without ending life and quieted panic without stealing will. She believed mercy was not released, but the strength to keep a body present when it wished to flee. She wrote notes about a hand behind the jaw and the soft place under the ribs where fear gathers, and practiced touch until the body answered. Eliza lived between pages. She drew leaf veins like roads and the curve of a lamb's jawbone. She watched the way a throat swelled when a note rose and wrote down the rhythm of a swallow. She believed the body had gates, and if one learned them, one could guide sound. In a cupboard she kept reeds carved by hand that fit near the back of the tongue and turned breath to tones. She tested them on animal throats and on her own, learning which shapes kept the voice steady and which bent it into a low hum. Together the sisters held rules that were never spoken aloud. No one entered the cellar unless all three were present. No one read Catherine's ledger. No brew was made unless Margaret named each ingredient twice. No singing after midnight unless Eliza began the hymn. They said grace before meals and cleaned after until their hands were raw. If a visitor asked for a tour, Catherine smiled and blamed a temperamental stove and a cluttered basement. No one pressed. They had the glow of model daughters, and people chose trust. In the shed by the fence stood an iron-clasped door. Behind it lay tools wrapped in cloth, plain bottles, cotton, and a wooden frame with soft pads. It held a body steady without rope. Margaret designed it from memory of birthing stools in church pews. It kept the shoulders square and the head cradled. She called it the brace. Eliza added a headrest that tilted by small degrees to open or ease the throat. Catherine chose flat buckles that would not snag a sleeve. They built it the way other households built hope chests. Church came first, then charity. They set out soup on the first Monday of each month and sewed blankets in winter. The pastor praised their devotion. Mothers told their daughters to be like the Blakes, useful, pure, still. The sisters accepted praise because it was covered. It made people less likely to notice a draft under a locked door or a stain scrubbed hard. Others held the shield for them. Evenings brought their private rites. They sat together in the parlor, palms flat on their skirts, and breathed as one. They counted to 30. Then Catherine said study, Margaret said mercy, and Eliza said voice. It was not a prayer they had been taught, but one they built, each word a corner around a need they would not name. Afterward they hummed a single tone until the walls held it. Eliza listened for the moment the sound thinned and learned to thicken it with breath. The house changed in quiet ways. Boards were replaced and drains were widened. A table that once held bread now held basins polished to a mirror shine. Clothes were boiled longer. The brace stood under a heavy cover. Margaret refined drops that cooled the body without closing the eyes. Eliza shaped reeds that made breath feel like a narrow path. Catherine timed how long a hum could steady shaking, and how far a person could be led by routine before noticing a line. People in Willard's Hollow saw 3 sisters of grace and nothing else. Winter thinned into gray spring. On Sunday, a young man named Thomas Reed walked up the path with flowers and a careful smile. Catherine opened the door as if the house had been waiting. The ledger had a page. The brace slept beneath its cover. The sisters' rule held: study, mercy, voice. To the town, what followed would look like misfortune. Inside, it felt like a step planned. Thomas Reed came to the Blake house with a hat held to his chest and the kind of smile that asked permission before it appeared. He had clean hands, a careful step, and a teacher's patience that made mothers trust him. Catherine opened the door as if she had been standing behind it the whole morning, her face calm, her dress pressed flat as paper. Margaret brought bread warm from the oven. Eliza watched the small tide in his throat when he thanked them for the welcome. They fed him soup that tasted of thyme. Catherine asked about his pupils and whether the river had flooded near the schoolhouse. Margaret set a mug by hand. Eliza listened for the moment his voice thinned. The sisters sang a low hymn, soft and steady. Thomas smiled like a careful guest. He returned on Thursday to a table with pie and a dish of salt. Catherine said the salt was from a far coast and should be taken for luck. Margaret measured 3 pinches. They spoke of weather and duty until very late, and when Thomas stood to go, Catherine said the willow path would be slick with ice. She offered the spare room, and he agreed. He lay still. At least, that is how the ledger later recorded it. Catherine wrote that his breath slowed, but Thomas did not truly sleep. He drifted in a warm dark edged with faint music and woke to a brace at his shoulders and a pillow cupping the base of his skull. The room smelled of lavender. Eliza adjusted the headrest by the notch of a finger. Catherine watched his eyes until they stilled. They did not call what followed harm. Each sister had a word that made it sound clean. Catherine called it study. Margaret called it mercy. Eliza called it a lesson in voice. They spoke in thin breaths. A narrow reed carved by Eliza's hand touched his lips and rested against the line of his tongue. Margaret's drops cooled the skin at his throat without taking feeling away. Catherine timed his breathing and set the metronome on the table. The arm swung. The method hid itself in small acts. They did not cut. They did not bruise. They asked the body to sing while still. The reed turned breath into a low tone that trembled at the edge of human sound. Eliza adjusted the headrest until the note steadied. Margaret pressed 2 fingers under his jaw to guide the swallow that wanted to break the tone. Catherine clicked the metronome and kept her focus. Hours stretched. They kept him there. When his breath faltered, Margaret touched a point under his ribs and found the place where fear gathers. She pressed until the panic dipped. When his eyes asked a question he could not voice, Catherine met them with an ordinary, patient gaze that said only, "Keep the pattern." Eliza wrote the seconds he could hold the sound, then moved the notch and asked again without words. They counted the shiver in his throat and hands as part of the lesson. They narrowed the room. A polished basin, the reed and the brace. Gentle hands offered no escape. They let him rest only when his pulse crossed Catherine's line. Margaret set a cup to his lips with a taste of something bitter but mild enough to keep him from sliding under. Eliza hummed the note so his body would return to it. They did not say why or when it would end. At some point the tone entered Thomas and would not leave. It lived behind his heartbeat and inside his teeth. They watched for that moment because once it nested, the body obeyed even in sleep. Eliza then exchanged the reed for a thinner one and lowered the metronome's swing. Margaret cooled his throat, then warmed his hands. Catherine whispered numbers and drew a line. They stood in a triangle around him until the tone in his chest felt like a rule. Dawn pressed gray against the window. The metronome slowed and stopped. Catherine closed the ledger and held Thomas's gaze for a long moment, almost kind. Margaret loosened the brace by one. Strap. Eliza set the reed on a clean cloth. Thomas cried without sound. Catherine folded a blanket over him with care and told him to sleep. Her voice held a teacher's calm. When the town asked after Thomas, the sisters spoke of a cousin upriver and a sudden visit. They said he had left a note with thanks for their kindness. The pastor nodded. Mothers warned their sons about travel after thaw. The river ran high. Life went on. The spare room was aired and the bedspread washed. Under the floorboards, the ledger kept its line. Eliza washed the reed and put it in a cotton box. Margaret cleaned the brace until its wood shone. Catherine counted the candles and put the metronome away. That night they breathed together and hummed the tone that had once lived in Thomas Reed. The house held it for a moment, then swallowed the sound. Outside, the willow bent over the water and the current carried the dark wash of their night work down the creek and away from the quiet white house. In the silent house the sisters rested, and the town, eager for easy answers, folded the day closed, never seeing the rule that had begun to govern breath. The winter broke into a sodden spring, the kind that carried mud into every doorway and damp into every lung. Willard's Hollow coughed and prayed its way through the thaw, and Margaret Blake moved through homes with her basket of herbs. To mothers she brought willow for fevers, mint for nausea, and lavender for restless sleep. Her hands were steady, her eyes gentle. No one questioned that she lingered near the beds of the weak, noting each breath and how long it held before trembling. They said she was a blessing, a girl who would have made her dead mother proud. In truth, Margaret measured more than illness. She learned where the body could be pressed into stillness, where breath could be slowed without breaking, and how long fear could be held before it shattered. The sisters no longer spoke of Thomas Reed aloud, but the house had changed since his absence. Catherine polished the brace until it gleamed, keeping it folded away beneath thick cloth. Eliza sharpened new reeds and carved the smallest channels, believing that sound could be drawn thin as thread. But it was Margaret who brought the next piece, the one she called her mercy. She claimed the body, if guided carefully, could endure pain without dying. If it was kept between agony and silence, it revealed something pure. Catherine agreed and wrote new columns in her ledger. Eliza listened with her head tilted, already hearing what a body stretched that far might sound like. Their experiments began with animals taken from farms under the excuse of tending wounds. Lambs, dogs, and once a heifer calf, each placed within the brace and given Margaret's drops. She pressed her fingers to ribs and jaws, finding points where pain dulled without fading. She murmured prayers as she worked, though her sisters knew the words were only rhythm to keep her hand steady. Catherine timed how long the creature could be kept in the thin place between living and ending. Eliza recorded the tones, a low hum that animals made when breath was stolen but not gone. They learned patience. They learned that mercy was not release, but control. When the sisters turned again to men, they dressed their cruelty in grace. Catherine welcomed the suitors with warm bread, Margaret with herbs to ease the chill of damp weather, and Eliza with shy smiles that made silence seem sweet. Each man believed himself chosen, believed he was being considered for marriage. That hope made him pliant. Catherine watched how quickly they finished their meals, how steady their eyes were during prayer. Margaret measured their pulse with a healer's excuse, counting the beats until the skin grew damp. Eliza noted the depth of their voices, already imagining how it might bend under a reed. The brace was their altar. Margaret's mercy was the sacrament. Drops cooled the tongue, fingers pressed into tender places, and voices turned to sound that no hymn had ever carried. Margaret insisted on prolonging every trial. She whispered that God wished to test endurance. That pain was proof of his design. Catherine wrote her words into the ledger as though they were scripture. Eliza, entranced, bent her ear close to throats and recorded the changes. When the sound wavered, Margaret adjusted, neither letting go nor allowing death to arrive. The cruelty lay in the extension. Hours stretched into nights, nights into days. When exhaustion threatened to silence the body, Margaret revived it with a draught so mild it gave hope. Then the suffering began again. To the town, nothing appeared amiss. Men left and were said to have traveled, taken to riverboats or the logging camps upriver. The Blakes spoke of letters that never arrived, cousins who had stopped through on sudden errands. The town believed because it wanted to. The sisters maintained their reputation with precision. They sewed for the poor, they knelt at the altar, they smiled when spoken to. The mask held. Behind the walls, the mercy deepened. Margaret's journals, hidden in the locked drawer, told more than she would ever say aloud. She drew the body as maps, circles marking the hidden switches of flesh. She wrote, under the jaw, stillness without silence. Between the ribs, fear without end. Behind the ear, memory halts but body obeys. These notes became her scripture. She convinced herself it was a form of compassion, that to learn the limits of pain was to dignify it. Catherine allowed this delusion, for it gave her sister purpose. Eliza only cared for the voices it produced. One night, after a trial that lasted longer than any before, Catherine stood over the exhausted body of a young man named Daniel Hayes. He had entered their home with the eager step of one who believed himself loved. Now he lay in the brace, his lips cracked, his eyes clouded, yet still. Margaret coaxed him to linger on the edge. Catherine wrote his hours into the ledger until her hand cramped. Eliza leaned close to his mouth, transfixed by the faint rasping note that slid from his throat as though he were half wind, half instrument. Margaret whispered, "He endures." Catherine closed the book and said nothing. They released him only when his body convulsed in final refusal, when even Margaret's mercy could not hold him in the thin place. The sisters carried him to the cellar floor and left him under linen. Afterward, Margaret wept into her hands, yet not for him. She wept because her mercy had failed, because the body had escaped before she was finished. Catherine pressed her shoulder and whispered that failure was study. Eliza drew a line across her page and said the sound had been enough. Between them, grief had no room. The townsfolk wondered quietly why Margaret's eyes looked more tired, why Catherine's ledger was kept closer at hand, why Eliza hummed in strange keys. But they hushed themselves with reminders of the sisters' kindness. No one wanted to doubt the Blakes. No one wanted to believe that mercy could be something darker than comfort. And so the sisters continued, sharpening their rules, strengthening their brace, refining their mercies until the line between healing and harm dissolved. To them it was never cruelty, it was only practice. And practice, they believed, was holy. The cellar grew colder with each season, though the sisters kept its lamps trimmed and its stones washed. The brace stood in the corner beneath a sheet, waiting like a pew before service. Eliza spent more hours there than her sisters knew. She sat with her notebook sketching not bones or birds, but the curve of a throat, the hinge of a jaw, the chords that trembled when sound passed through. She believed the body was an instrument, and she believed God had hidden a hymn inside every man. To draw it out was not cruelty, she told herself, but revelation. When she was small, Eliza had stood near the church choir and closed her eyes as the voices rose. She had listened not to the words, but to the vibration that lived between the walls. She remembered that feeling long after sermons faded. Now, in the basement where no sunlight reached, she tried to make it return. She carved reeds thin as needles, shaping them until air alone made them whistle. She built small channels that bent a note into strange curves. Then she turned to the brace, to the still men who lay with heads cradled and jaws tilted by the notch of her design. The first attempt startled even Catherine. A reed fitted in place, Margaret's drop steadying the throat, and Eliza pressing gently beneath the jaw until breath found the channel. What came was not a cry, but a tone, low and unearthly, as though a hymn had been broken into fragments and reassembled with missing pieces. It wavered, slipped, and returned again, until the walls of the cellar seemed to hum. Catherine watched with narrowed eyes, marking the length of each sound. Margaret whispered prayers over the man, though her voice trembled. Eliza wrote the moments down and smiled faintly when the note held. From then on, sound became the center of their work. Catherine recorded each trial with the precision of Scripture. Margaret applied her mercies to prolong endurance, and Eliza listened for patterns. Sometimes the tones were guttural, sometimes shrill. Sometimes they fell into a rhythm that matched the metronome's swing, creating a harmony that seemed planned. The sisters called these their hymns. To them it was proof that God had hidden music even in suffering. To the men beneath the brace, it was only the collapse of their own voices turned against them. Neighbors began to notice faint echoes drifting from the Blake house at night. Walking past after evening service, some swore they heard singing, strange, low chants that rose and fell as if the sisters held midnight prayers. But no one dared knock or question. Who would accuse the purest daughters of Willard's Hollow? And so the whispers spread, tangled between fear and admiration. People said the Blakes were blessed, that their homes sang with holiness. The truth, of course, was darker than anyone dared to imagine. Eliza pursued perfection. She adjusted reeds until the sound lengthened, shifted headrests until the tone deepened, and pressed her fingers at precise points until the throat vibrated in ways no choir could match. She called it harmony, though it was built on breaking. She hummed alongside the men, guiding their bodies like instruments. Catherine timed the length each voice could sustain, comparing one suitor to another as though they were choir boys. Margaret insisted on stretching endurance even when the men's eyes dimmed with exhaustion. She believed that by holding them longer, by forcing the sound to continue, she preserved them in a holy state. The cellar became their chapel, the brace their altar, and the hymns of broken voices their liturgy. Each session ended the same. Catherine closed the ledger with care, Margaret pressed drops to still shaking hands, and Eliza set the reed aside on a clean cloth. The man beneath the brace lay slack, voice silenced, body trembling. Sometimes they lived long enough to be released, wandering away in silence, broken and unrecognizable. More often they slipped into the stillness from which no mercy could revive them. Their absence was explained easily. Gone to sea, to logging, to some nameless road beyond town. The sisters spoke of them with gentle sighs and folded hands, and no one questioned further. The hymns remained. Eliza heard them even when no one was in the brace. She hummed in the garden, pruning roses to the rhythm of notes once forced from trembling throats. Catherine heard them too, but spoke only of patterns of study. Margaret wept sometimes, clutching her hands to her chest as though the sound had burrowed into her bones. Yet she returned each time, convinced that to stop would mean abandoning the mercy she had promised. By summer, the Blakes' house carried an aura of sanctity. Visitors described a peace that settled over them the moment they entered. Some said the sisters sang while they worked, their voices strange and lovely, as if carrying echoes of something otherworldly. Few recognized the unease that crept beneath that beauty. It was easier to believe in holy music than to ask where the suitors had gone. The hymns hid the absence like a veil. Eliza's notebooks filled with lines, sketches of throats, diagrams of reeds, notations of tones. She wrote phrases in margins: the body is a pipe, the voice a wind, and sound proves the soul still clings. She believed she was touching something eternal. Catherine allowed her obsession, seeing in it only further order. Margaret whispered more prayers even as her mercy stretched into cruelty. Together they convinced themselves they were not tormentors but keepers of hidden hymns. But voices do not break without leaving traces. Some men's families began to wonder why their last letters carried strange tones in the handwriting, as if written with trembling hands. Some neighbors swore the Blakes' late-night songs did not match any hymn from church. Whispers grew, though still without courage, to bloom into suspicion. In Willard's Hollow, silence was stronger than truth. And in that silence the hymns of broken voices echoed, growing bolder with each passing season. Summer ripened and began to spoil at the edges, and with it the Blake house changed its scent from lavender to smoke. Catherine said it was for pests in the garden. Sticks burned in small heaps to keep beetles from beans. But the smoke clung even on days without wind. Neighbors praised her care and returned to chores. Behind the polite story lived a furnace built from a bread oven and iron plates rescued from a mill burned years before. It sat in the shed behind the willow, a low iron mouth with a narrow flue that bled heat into the night. Inside, Catherine kept a grate, polished bright, and tongs wrapped in linen, and she checked the door twice each morning, then once at dusk, as if the safety of the house depended on the right kind of fire. They had begun with sound and mercy and the brace that turned the body into a steady instrument. Now Catherine said the work needed a circle to hold the pattern so it would not fray. Study asked for endings, and endings made waste. Waste, she believed, was dangerous. It invited discovery and gave rumor something to grasp. So she wrote an order that returned every trace to the house and then sent it away, small enough to ride unnoticed on breath. It looked like prayer in her ledger. Fire, ash, salt, bread, welcome. She traced the words with a fingernail until grooves formed and her shoulders eased. With a circle, sin became tasks, and tasks, written neatly, felt harmless. The first suitor chosen for the circle was a cooper named Jonathan Pike, broad-shouldered, careful with his hands, proud of barrels that held through winter storms. He came to supper with splinters still in his palms, and Catherine smiled at the mark of work. The table was simple: bread, a stew of roots and onions, and a shallow dish of coarse salt in the middle, as if the sea had visited their inland town. Margaret bowed her head and spoke a blessing with a steady voice. Eliza hummed a note that glowed from the walls and faded, a cue that the house had closed around him. Jonathan tasted the salt and praised the stew. He did not notice how Catherine watched the climb of his throat each time he swallowed. Night turned Jonathan Pike into a lesson. The brace received him. The reed found its place. Margaret kept him on the edge with mercies that knew exactly how far a man could bend without breaking. He held the tone until it scraped raw against the room and returned again, a low thread that tied him to the sister's patience. When the tone failed him, Catherine's pattern did not. She read from the ledger as if counting rain. Eliza traced the line of his throat as it changed under the work and listened for the place where sound becomes only breath. Margaret steadied the heart that wished to run. Dawn lifted a dull light across the cellar stones, and the sisters stood very still, as if stillness could make the room forget what it had seen. They wrapped him in linen and climbed the steps in a hush that felt like worship. The metronome kept silent on the table. The furnace waited. Catherine lit it with slow care, laying kindling like a small house whose corners matched the corners in her ledger. Margaret washed the body with water that steamed in the morning chill, and combed the hair away from the brow as if preparing a patient for rest. Eliza carried parcels of cloth that held hair and a bit of nail. The fragments she saved as if each were a note from the hymn now ended. The furnace took everything they offered. It turned into ash without any noise. Catherine watched the color through the grate as if reading weather, never letting the fire flare beyond her line. When it sank to an even glow, she set the plates, closed the door, and the shed became only a quiet breath of heat. Outside, smoke curled into the willow leaves and drifted down the creek where no one would think to follow. This was the part Catherine named return. She took a pinch of ash and stirred it into salt until the gray vanished. She mixed what remained into bread dough with hands that had learned to knead since childhood. Eliza pressed her palm to the warm mass and felt the small living rise of yeast answer her touch. Margaret said mercy did not end with breath. Mercy meant keeping what had been within what would be. The loaf was baked on a clean stone and cooled by the window. When the cooper's friends came asking, the sisters spoke of a job upriver and sent a small loaf to his mother with a kind note. The woman broke it at supper and said it tasted like a blessing. After Jonathan Pike, the circle repeated with careful pace. Not every suitor entered it. Some left the house still breathing thin and quiet, fading into roads that led away from Willard's Hollow. But for those Catherine chose, the pattern held. The furnace burned without scandal. Ash went into salt and then into bread. The bread moved into guests and neighbors. In time, the sisters kept a tin of gray in the cupboard, a store they called memory. At church suppers, a pinch joined the dough with thyme and honey, and men praised the crust. Whispers floated anyway. Smoke at odd hours, bread richer than it should be, a hush in the house. Yet armor held. The pastor praised their devotion. By harvest the habit was fixed, and beyond the fence rumor learned speech. By autumn the hollow itself seemed to hold its breath. The river ran low, leaving stones slick with moss, and the air in town grew restless. Men were missing, too many to fold into accident or chance. Their names clung to church walls: Thomas Reed, Daniel Hayes, Jonathan Pike. And though each disappearance was explained, the explanations wore thin. Mothers whispered of riverboats that stole their sons, fathers muttered about drinking and wandering, and still the pews emptied by inches. People lowered their voices when speaking of courtship, as though the word itself had grown dangerous. And always the Blake sisters stood apart, luminous in their calm. Catherine kept her head bowed during service. Margaret offered herbs for fever. Eliza hummed beneath her breath. They lived as though untouched by rumor, and their poise made the town doubt itself. How could three pious women, orphaned yet steady, be the root of such loss? To question them felt like questioning the order of God himself, and so suspicion remained soft, passed hand to hand like a candle shielded from the wind. Still whispers found their way. At the well, women spoke of smoke rising from the Blake shed, even in the still hours of night. A farmhand swore he heard voices from the cellar, low tones that did not match any hymn. A mother, holding her son close, warned him never to linger near the Willow Creek path, though she could not say why. Children dared each other to run up the sisters' fence and touch the gate, fleeing when shadows moved across the curtained windows. The house had become both holy and haunted, and in Willard's Hollow those words were not so different. Inside the house, the sisters felt the stir of unease but did not break their pattern. Catherine reminded them that the rumor was powerless if their order held. Margaret said mercy must continue, for to stop would waste what had been learned. Eliza cared little for voices outside. She heard her own hymns louder now, even in sleep. They grew bolder. Their work lengthened. They pursued perfection as though it could silence fear. One evening, Catherine brought out a loaf from the furnace bread and cut it into small squares for visitors after service. She watched closely as neighbors ate, as though the act of sharing bound their silence to her own. Margaret distributed herbs with gentle eyes, asking after children's coughs. Eliza hummed a note too low to be recognized, but it slid under the chatter like a thread weaving through cloth. The neighbors left uneasy yet unable to place why. Fear without shape is easier to ignore, and the sisters gave them no shape to hold. But not all were convinced. Edward Mallory, the young schoolteacher, kept a quiet record of the missing men. He wrote their names on his chalkboard after lessons, then wiped them away before the next morning bell. He noticed the pattern others denied. Each man last seen walking up the Willow path, each man a guest of the Blakes. He said nothing at first, believing perhaps that he alone saw it. But the silence in town was too thick, and silence itself began to feel like guilt. Meanwhile, the rituals grew more ambitious. Margaret refined her mercies until a body could be held on the edge for days, breathing shallow but steady. Catherine measured tones against candle drips, recording which lasted longest before faltering. Eliza carved reeds so narrow they turned breath into shrieks that scraped the walls. They listened, They studied, they endured, convinced that their work transcended cruelty. To them, it was progress. To those outside, it was absence and fear. Autumn leaves gathered in the creek, carried slowly by the current, and still smoke curled from the Blake shed. The whispers thickened with the fog. By now everyone knew of the pattern, though few dared name it. In church, eyes turned to the sister's pew with unease, and yet no one spoke aloud. Evil had woven itself into the hollow not with thunder but with quiet routine. And the more routine it became, the harder it was for anyone to see where it began, or how it could end. The sisters hummed together in the parlor, three voices blending until the house itself seemed to breathe. Outside, children pressed ears to their mothers' skirts, and men lowered their gaze as they passed the gate. Whispers traveled, but whispers were not enough. The Blake's secret lived on, wrapped in silence stronger than suspicion. For in Willard's Hollow it was easier to accept fear than to challenge grace. Edward Mallory did not go to the Blake house as a fool or a romantic. He went because the order deserved a witness. He kept a list of missing men under his blotter, names and last sightings copied in calm lines. He walked the willow path like a teacher crossing the room, noting cut brush, tamped earth, and how the trail widened near the creek. He told no one. In his best coat he could pass as a suitor, which is what the sisters invited and the town excused. They welcomed him with an ease that made doubt feel rude. Supper tasted of onions and thyme. Catherine watched his throat when he swallowed. Margaret poured tea with a trace of willow. Eliza let a low tone ride under the talk, like a draft beneath a door. Edward noticed a polished basin, a metronome half hidden by a book, and a cellar door with a new lock and bright boards. He placed these facts in a quiet row in his mind and smiled like any careful guest. Night narrowed the house. The spare room was made with a neatness that felt like ritual. Edward lay on the bedspread and counted his breaths until the numbers blurred. Music lived in the walls, patient as weather. He woke to hands that did not strike or bind, only guided. The brace received his shoulders, the headrest cupped the base of his skull. A strap crossed his wrists in the name of order. Margaret's drops cooled his throat. Eliza set the metronome and shifted the notch of the headrest by a finger's width. A reed touched his lips. Breath became a tone, low and steady, as if it had been waiting there all along. Edward felt the sound travel along his palate and down his chest. The sisters moved with practiced calm. Catherine kept time and watched his eyes like numbers on a slate. Margaret pressed 2 fingers beneath his jaw when panic threatened the line. Eliza bent close and searched the note for purity the way a choir leader seeks pitch, though no hymn had ever asked for this kind of obedience. Hours unspooled with clean, brutal order. They extended him without hurry, turning him into a lesson that matched their rules. When his breath frayed, Margaret steadied it with warmth along the ribs. When his voice shook, Eliza altered the angle of his head until the tone fell back onto its narrow path. Catherine wrote 3 columns. Endurance, obedience, light. The moment a man stops reaching for escape and allows the pattern to close around him. Edward counted the cracks in the ceiling and followed the metronome because there was nowhere else to go. Their most elaborate work began when Eliza removed the reed and fitted a finer one that drew his breath into wire. Margaret laid warm cloths along his chest and abdomen, and marked shapes with pins, careful as a midwife planning a birth. Catherine opened a drawer and produced labels in her strict hand: heart, lungs, liver, guilt, resolve, duty. She arranged them along his skin until his body read like a chart. They were not content with sound alone. They wanted a tableau, a living lesson where anatomy and conscience were displayed in one obedient line. Edward fought to stay whole. He fixed on a hairline in the plaster and measured it the way he measured days. He held the tones because the brace in the hands and the rules left no other path. His breath swept across the labels like a pointer. A tone for heart, a tone for lungs, a tone for liver, a long, thin thread for duty that burned his throat. Catherine watched for surrender. Eliza leaned closer when harmony flashed for a heartbeat and then was gone. Margaret kept him present, asking the body to remain where pain and silence met. Dawn found him still breathing. The labels left pale prints. The metronome slowed and stopped. Catherine closed the ledger and offered him a blanket with a calm that could pass for kindness. Eliza smiled at the faint hum that still lived in him. Margaret warmed his hands and called it mercy. They had turned his body into a book they could read, and they were not done. They let him rest only to hold him longer, sure the second day would bring perfection. Edward understood that if he did not break the pattern, he would become another name folded into silence. He waited until Eliza changed reeds and Margaret lifted his chin to ease a swallow. Then he gave an extra breath where the tone demanded stillness. It was a small error, almost nothing, but it made the whistle jump and scrape the back of his throat. He coughed, not hard, just enough to send saliva across the labels and to knock the metronome's arm from its mark. The sound went ragged. Eliza frowned. Margaret hesitated. For a breath the room lost its rhythm. He coughed again and the reed bit his tongue. Water sloshed from the basin. The metronome fell. Edward did not think it would save him. He only hoped it would make a seam in their order. He spoke one broken word that was not a plea but a fact, his own name, because a fact can weigh more than a hymn when the mind is drowning. It startled Eliza and the reed slipped from her fingers. The tone died. The house felt suddenly dangerously quiet. The sisters recovered with terrifying speed. Catherine reset the metronome. Margaret checked his pulse and pressed the place beneath the jaw that quieted the revolt. Eliza set a fresh reed with careful hands. Order returned, thinner but intact. Catherine's mouth hardened. The circle, she decided, must be finished. She sent Margaret to tend the shed and brought out a clean cloth to carry the labels a second time. Edward watched the window's pale square and knew the day would end in ash if the pattern held. In the schoolyard, children would stand before a silent slate. In the church, whispers would gather like leaves at the door. Along the creek, a thin smoke already curled into the willow's crown. Inside the house, the brace held fast, the reed waited, and the lesson, their most perfect lesson, poised to begin again. Edward held his breath for one last count, listening for a sound beyond the room. He heard only the sisters, steady as ever, and the quiet turning of the house toward its chosen end. The house never once paused. Dawn lifted to a thin ribbon of smoke over Willow Creek, and by noon, the town felt Edward Mallory's absence like extra weight on every pew. Mothers gathered sons, fathers laid down tools, and a quiet column of neighbors walked the willow path toward the White House that had always looked like safety. They came with the tired resolve of people who had finally named their fear. The gate stood open. The front door yielded to a knock and revealed rooms arranged as if for company, chairs squared to a hearth gone cold. In the shed they found a furnace mouth packed with gray, a metronome tipped on its side, a box of reeds wrapped in cotton and labels curled by steam. The creek told what the house would not, ash drifting in soft veils along the bank, curling around willow roots and breaking apart when touched. The sisters were gone. The house was sealed, a watch set at dusk, and for the first time the hollow let itself say the word that had lived under its breath for a year. Evil. Grief did not arrive clean. It settled like weather that would not break. Names once whispered were read aloud, and the church sounded hollow with the echo of them. Families gathered the small tokens that remained, letters, buttons, a handkerchief pressed thin by years of folding. An inquiry met in the schoolhouse where Edward's slate still held the faint dust of names rubbed away. Neighbors spoke of night music and smoke and of trusting reputation because it asked nothing of them. The sheriff wrote what the town confessed. The sisters had been shielded by the image everyone needed them to keep. The willow shed was broken open and the ash buried at the bend where children once fished. No bodies were found, but absence became fact, and the hollow recorded itself in careful lines as if order could atone for what order had hidden. From that slow work came changes that outlived the season. The county ordered that any person missing beyond 3 days be sought in concert by sworn men, and that names be posted in every parish list. Private furnaces and kilns were to be registered and inspected. Unmarked fires were torn down. Midwives and healers, once trusted by custom alone, now carried written warrants from physicians in the nearest city. Courtship customs shifted. Chaperones returned to parlors and sudden invitations lost their shine. In time, the state printed a small circular called the Blake Provision, directing constables to open inquiries quickly and to search sheds and cellars as if they were rooms, not afterthoughts. Years passed and the White House leaned. Ivy took the clapboards. The willow pressed roots through the shed floor. The furnace sank into rust. In 1868, an almshouse matron recorded a deathbed confession from a woman calling herself M, who said mercy had been the word that ruined her and begged that the lost be named each autumn. In 1871, workmen repairing a church beam found a ledger spine hidden in the hollow. Lists without overt crime, only hours, pulses, and tones. In 1892, the families built a memorial of river stone at the bend where ash had once drifted. It carried no carved faces, only names and a blank panel for those never proven. Each harvest a bell was tolled, and the list was spoken in the square, beginning with Thomas Reed and ending with the names most recently claimed by time. The memorial did not prove, it witnessed. The story did not end with the sisters vanishing. It settled into the town like a rule. Children were taught to distrust any sanctity that requires secrecy. Pastors revised homilies to say that evil wears the face you most want to see. The new measures did not promise safety, they demanded attention. And attention, the town learned, is a kind of love that denies silence its power. In the end, the hollow did not chase ghosts. It practiced notice and found that practice to be the opposite of fear. The narrator must say what the hollow learned, that evil rarely shouts, It learns your customs, borrows your manners, and hides its hunger inside chores and hymns. It needs only your willingness to prefer a bright curtain to a hard question. In Willard's Hollow, the cost of that preference was measured in voices that will not return. What do you think? Could this happen again? Answer with care, because quiet choices matter to everyone.